Islamic State has been steadfastly manifesting itself in Libya, a country that has been in chaos since the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. Joining us now for more on the latest moves and what the West's reaction should be, in Washington, D.C. via Skype, there's Hussein Ibish. He's senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, and you can read his blog post at Ibish Blog. And Hussein, it's always good to have you on the program. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much indeed.
Not at all. Good to have you here. The biggest development, of course, this week was not actually in Syria or Iraq as it relates to IS, but rather in Libya, where they released a video of an execution of 21 Egyptians decapitated. I guess this will come as news to many people that didn't know IS was in Libya. When did they get there?
Well, there have been signs of this emerging over the past few weeks, but I think this is the first sort of major dramatic action that emphasizes the fact that some ISIS people may have gone to Libya, but more importantly, that armed jihadists already operating in Libya appear to have pledged allegiance to the ISIS commander Abu Bakr Baghdadi and rebranded themselves as part of that group. And then also, importantly, as part of this video, received the kind of technical assistance in terms of messaging and slick propaganda that ISIS is known for. So really have become part of that group in every possible way.
And how significant do you think the support is in Libya for Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, call it what you will?
Well, they're not part of the dynamic fight that's going on between the two big rival factions in Libya over power and oil and control. There are two rival governments in two different cities representing roughly to some extent East and West tensions, but also Islamist versus non-Islamist and various factions within the Middle East, and that's really the big picture in the conflict inside Libya and the potential partition that Libya faces, that big conflict. ISIS and these people who've rebranded themselves as ISIS in Libya is not really part of that, so they're not huge. But obviously they're big enough to have staged this atrocity, filmed it, put it out, and they're probably growing because I think ISIS's ability to attract the craziest of the crazies and to be the paramount group at the moment in that sort of ultra-violent jihadist world is only growing. It's not receding as far as we can tell. Can
you tell us more about the Egyptians who were killed in this incident?
Yeah, there were 21 Coptic Christian Egyptians who were in Libya for various reasons. I mean, really, they're essentially working there, as far as I understand it. Although there are other Egyptians who go to Libya for other reasons. Really, these are people who go for work. And one of the things that is happening here is that Egyptians sort of go to Libya because of the oil industry and other industries there and try to work there. But these people were seized by unknown forces a few weeks ago. They may have been captured by an IS group. They may have been captured by a group that then rebranded itself as IS or sold to this group that calls itself IS now. And they're basically innocent people. They're just Egyptian citizens who are Christians. And the title of this video was A Message to the Nation of the Cross Signed in Blood. And so that's, in other words, what ISIS is trying to say is we're killing these people because they're Christians as a message to the nation of the cross. Now, that could be taken to be Christendom in general, the Christians of the world, the United States, or what have you. It's certainly not Egypt. However, Egypt definitely took it personally, responded angrily, very, very angrily, and bombed IS positions in Libya. So the message had multiple audiences. Obviously, the people that ISIS wants to recruit, Egypt itself, the Christian world, and the United States.
And there have been some mutterings about IS now having gone into Libya, going not that further north, into Italy. What do you make of those allegations?
Well, it was a specific threat made on the video. The video was staged on a coastline, and it purports to be, and I don't think there's any reason really to doubt it, the Mediterranean Sea, the Mediterranean coast on the north shores of Libya. And the spokesman of the group sort of pointed with his bloodstained knife after the murders and referred to ISIS's long-held vow to conquer Rome. Now that sort of sounds weird. Why Rome? Well, of course, it's a throwback to this kind of medieval idea that, it's kind of medieval cultural landscape where Rome is the center of Christendom, the center of Western culture and civilization, all those things that it really isn't and hasn't been for a long time. But it's both symbolic and literal. And the fact is, of course, to come back to reality, that if IS is operating on the north coast of Libya, then it is very close to Italy and very close specifically to Sicily. It is really just not that far. In addition to which, the spokesman that I referred to who made these threats spoke in distinctly American English with an Arabic accent, but very much American English, again emphasizing that IS has people in it who are cosmopolitan, who are Western, who have access to Western passports, and therefore have the potential to penetrate the West as well.
Okay, thank you for laying out that background. Let's now also welcome from New Haven, Connecticut, Graham Wood to our broadcast. He's contributing editor at The Atlantic. His most recent feature is What ISIS Really Wants. It's the cover in March's issue. And Graham, let me ask you to sort of pick up from where Hussein left us off there, which is, how worried do you think the Italians are that IS will attack them?
I think they're not very worried. First of all, 200 miles over open ocean is quite a long ways to go, actually, if you don't have a military if you don't have a navy. So I think that it's certain that there will be more attacks on European soil. But the kind of existential threat that people are talking about, the kind of threat of taking over St. Peter's, that will not happen.
All right, in which case let's go back to the Egyptian angle on the story then. How stable at the moment do you think the Egyptian government is, and therefore how able to take on this clear challenge to their authority?
I think that there are some serious threats to Egypt. Of course, in the Sinai, there is a great deal of Islamic State activity already. And I think that there is enough question of the legitimacy of the government of Sisi that the Islamic State could be successful in actually separating and polarizing the opinion of the country. What they wanted to do was to provoke a reaction from Egypt so they could get that polarization. I wrote in my article that this is an apocalyptic movement. They would love to see sides drawn up. And Sisi is not really a figure of the same kind of credibility, I suppose, as a figure who might be viewed as someone you'd rally behind in an apocalyptic battle.
We are going to talk more about that prediction of apocalypse that was the thesis behind your Atlantic piece a little later in our conversation. But let me get one more thing in on something I also asked Hussein, which is how significant do you think the expansion of ISIS into now a third country beyond Iraq and Syria, how significant do you think it is now?
The expansion of ISIS is very important to its propaganda. ISIS continually states that it's a caliphate that is expanding. It's expanding and eventually is angling toward world domination. So to be able to say to its potential adherents, the enthusiasts who are backing it, that yes, look, our territory is growing just as we claimed, is a very important thing. And limiting that by the same token would begin to show that that narrative is mistaken.
And Hussein, do you anticipate that ISIS has plans beyond the countries we associate with it now, for example, where other Islamic extremists operate? I think of Nigeria, Boko Haram, etc.
Well, without doubt. I think that's exactly right. The whole point of declaring Abu Bakr Baghdadi the Caliph was really not out of any sincere, serious hope of winning the hearts and minds of average Muslims or average Arabs anywhere in the world. I mean, I think this is a vanguardist group. They know very well they're not going to appeal to the general public. I think they're appealing to an extreme wing, an extreme fringe. But the idea there, I think, is to declare him the leader of the world's Muslims precisely to draw in all of these groups and to essentially say to them, look, all you have to do is pledge allegiance to the Caliph and you'll become part of this movement automatically. That will then bring you into this appointed vehicle for the redemption of history, and then you won't simply be a jihadist operating with some ideals. You'll be part of this sort of grand purification of history and time and whatnot. And so I think their ambition is indeed global, and it's certainly in the immediate term is to bring in as many of these groups as possible, and that's the nightmare scenario, is to see a kind of domino effect of one group after another pledging allegiance to Baghdadi and joining ISIS. And I agree completely with Graham that the successes that they have are perceived by them as sort of proving the divine mandate that they have, and as demonstrating that, in fact, these are divinely sanctioned victories. And so every success that they have seems to reinforce that. Momentum is key to the ISIS illusion, to the ISIS mystique. And certainly breaking it is crucial, because it would be very difficult to explain how you have the divine mandate if you suffer a series of devastating defeats.
Graham, if in fact they have this momentum behind them right now, and if their numbers are growing, what does that say about the West's attempts to degrade and or destroy the ISIS movement?
You know, in one sense, the West's attempts, it's really more than the West, have succeeded. And in that sense, they've succeeded in Iraq and in Syria, because parts of ISIS territory that were once firmly controlled by them, they've been rolled back particularly by the Kurds. So as they've expanded to these other areas like Libya, like Afghanistan, they've done so really trying to use a different tactic. That is, they could no longer take territory militarily that was contiguous with the area they governed in Iraq and Syria, and instead they're looking for these pledges of allegiance. You know, containing them in each of the spots where they set up a franchise, though, will be difficult, and of course the most important thing will be to have allies who are Muslims, who are our proxies to do that, to avoid confirming this narrative of crusaders versus Islam.
Graham, let me follow up with this, and this question is going to focus more directly on what you talked about earlier and what you write about in the Atlantic cover story for March, and that is this notion of an apocalyptic vision of the future that IS is chasing. Can you tell us what that apocalypse actually looks like in their eyes?
Yes, I can, and this is from Muslim apocalyptic literature. What's really distinctive about ISIS, even relative to, say, Al-Qaeda, is that they think this is all happening quite soon. Al-Qaeda never seemed to work on a calendar timeline of when they expected the world to end. But ISIS says very clearly that they want to seize a particular city that was mentioned in Hadith about in northern Syria called Dabik. When they've seized that city already, there will be a battle there between the Crusaders and the Muslims will win. And that will really kick off the choreography for this whole drama of conquest that goes through the apocalypse. And I should mention that video in Libya, the American or Canadian accented murderer who was emceeing that, he specifically referred to these apocalyptic events, and specifically to a future victory in the city of Jerusalem that is also foretold in Hadith. So they frequently lace their propaganda, their statements, internally and externally, with mentions of this kind of future that they have a starring role in.
You know, that's an important part. The return of Jesus is an important part of this apocalyptic scenario that ISIS buys into, which would surprise, I think, a lot of Christians. But he put a lot of emphasis on Jesus coming back and smashing the cross and killing the swine and all of that stuff. It's very overwrought and bizarre, but some people believe it. Okay,
Hussein, well, do you believe it?
Certainly not. It's preposterous. I mean, first of all, I'm not a religious person, but of the Muslims that I know don't buy into any of this stuff at all. It's within the Islamic world. It's the whole apocalyptic version of Islam is a fringe, first of all, and then secondly, there are many different versions. There are many different Sunni versions. There are clear differences between Sunni and Shiite versions and others. So ISIS has a particular one that they've locked into, and you know, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic and so brutal.
Well, Graham, it does raise questions about how the West is supposed to take, or those who are opposed, not just the West, but those who are opposed to IS are supposed to take them on, because you do say in the piece that setbacks dealt to the Islamic State mean nothing, since God has preordained the near destruction of his people anyway. How are you supposed to defeat a group that is, in some respects, and doesn't care if it wins any battles?
Well, you know, in a sense, they do mean quite a bit, the setbacks. They don't mean anything ideologically to the group, because they already are expecting to be reduced to a core of 5,000 fighters around the city of Jerusalem before Jesus comes back to their aid. But you know, there are certain aspects of this prophetic model and this apocalyptic view that they have that suggest directions that they might especially want to move in. They mention the city of Dabiq. One of the executioners, when the head of the executed American hostage, Abdurrahman Peter Kassig, was shown, said, "This is the first crusader who will be buried in Dabiq." And you know, that gives a sense of the strategic directions they have to go to fulfill their own propaganda.
Right.
You know, it's not clear that we should follow their advice, but we have an idea of what they value, and we can take that into account as we make our own plans.
Hussein?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I also think it's true that counter messaging is essential. And that's going to have to come from the Muslim allies of the United States, or at least the Muslim enemies, and particularly the Sunni Muslim enemies of IS. But I think the United States does have a role in coordinating with that. And what that has to do, I think, is to challenge every aspect of IS's effort to co-opt different aspects of the Islamic traditions, heritage, teachings, etc., and to rationalize and validate their criminal activities and their mad campaign. I think it's essential to do that, and it's rather troubling, I think, that there hasn't been a coordinated effort to do that by the clerisy, by the Sunni Muslim clerisy in the Middle East. There's a lot of repudiation of ISIS, but it isn't coordinated, and it isn't a campaign. It's just people dismissing them and damning them and cursing them, you know, at a very high level. But that's different than organizing a sophisticated messaging campaign that can counter their sophisticated messaging campaign.
You've both mentioned Dabiq, and I want to read an excerpt from Graham's piece that focuses on that. Here we go. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this up. "Here we are, burying the first American crusader in Dabiq, eagerly waiting for the remainder of your armies to arrive," said a masked executioner in a November video showing the severed head of Peter Abdul Rahman Kassig, the aid worker who had been held captive for more than a year. During fighting in Iraq in December, after Mujahideen perhaps inaccurately reported having seen American soldiers in battle, Islamic State Twitter accounts erupted in spasms of pleasure like overenthusiastic hosts or hostesses upon the arrival of the first guests at a party. Does the goal, Graham, to you seem like IS is trying to bait the West into a fight that it actually may not be able to win?
Oh, without question. There's no doubt that the purpose of these videos is to bait the United States, NATO, the West, the Crusaders into a fight. They are openly taunting. That they say, "I'm back, Obama." This is a common phrase. They always are saying how much they look forward to seeing U.S. Marines in battle against them.
So should America deny them that?
I do doubt it, though.
America should certainly take into account that this would confirm every narrative that they have, and actually that a lot of other jihadist organizations have. The notion that there is a fight between Islam and the West is something that can easily be confirmed by a photograph of an American Marine expeditionary unit coming toward a whole bunch of Muslims in Syria. So that should certainly be taken into account, the optics of that.
So if this is what they want, Hussein, should America...
So.
Oh, you don't agree? Okay.
I don't agree with that. Yeah, it's the one thing in Graham's article, which is otherwise very good, that I don't agree with. I simply have a different judgment, and that I don't think is internally consistent. I think his analysis is very strong. And he mentions the extent to which IS is different from Al-Qaeda and others in that it wanted to seize territory and create a state and build its strength before confronting the regional order and the international order and all that. I think that was very well explained in his article, and I think that's right. But I think that analysis hasn't completely changed in the past few months. And I think that honestly, the ISIS experience with the United States is of a country that's drawing down from the Middle East, of a country that is deterrable, is dissuadable, that doesn't want a big fight, wants to leave Iraq, wants to leave Afghanistan, wants to not get involved in Syria, wants to draw down. The Obama administration, I think, is a very good example of this and represents that. And under those circumstances, I think it's perfectly possible to interpret all of this as efforts to actually dissuade and discourage opponents and to terrify them away. I think they've had some success at that in Iraq and Syria. And I think that there is a case to be made that there is a grand misjudgment being made here by ISIS to actually think that this may have a deterrent effect, or at least some people in that group may think so. So I don't think there's no question that this is intended as a provocation. I think there is a big question mark, and I still see it as more of a deterrent.
Okay, let me jump in with one last excerpt from Graham's piece that I want to read. We're down to our last couple of minutes, so I'll get a quick reaction from both of you. Graham writes, virtually every major decision and law promulgated by the Islamic State adheres to what it calls in its press and pronouncements and on its billboards, license plates, stationery, and coins, quote, the prophetic methodology, which means following the prophecy and example of Muhammad in punctilious detail. Muslims can reject the Islamic State, nearly all do, but pretending that it isn't actually a religious millenarian group with theology that must be understood to be combated has already led the United States to underestimate it. And Graham, to that end, I want to just ask you about President Obama's speech of a couple of days ago where he really went out of his way to say he doesn't regard ISIS as having anything to do with Islam. Do you think it's a problem that the president doesn't want to make that connection?
I think it's a problem if the connection is not something that he understands. But, you know, when presidents speak, it's political speech, and there are reasons that are related to decency that are related to his desire to make sure that Muslims are assured that the United States does not think that it and ISIS are connected in any way. But it is simply a matter of fact that ISIS arises out of Islamic traditions. And these traditions, of course, are extremely diverse, they're contradictory, and, but there's no question that the kinds of justification, discourse, and rhetoric that they use emerge from Islamic texts and things Muslims have done. So it's just simply factually incorrect for him to say that they're un-Islamic, but I understand why you might do that.
Hussein, in our last minute here, can you weigh in on this notion of why many Western leaders seem unprepared to want to draw that link?
It's a strategic decision, and it makes sense in order to preserve the sensibilities of Muslims who should be allies, need to be allies in this fight, to say that this isn't Islamic at all, because it's bad. Therefore, it isn't Islamic. But, I mean, the truth is not hard. There's no need for us to get into a huge debate, which we are in now, unfortunately, about the relationship between Islam and the Islamic State. It's really quite straightforward. It would be a mistake to say that there's nothing Muslim about this or Islamic about this, because clearly there's a bunch of fanatical Muslims. At the same time, it would be a mistake to say these are the Muslims, or the authentic Muslims, or the real Muslims. In fact, this is a group of crazy Muslims with an extreme agenda and an extreme interpretation that is eccentric and bizarre and dangerous, but it is a version of Islam that they're practicing and preaching. So, I mean, it's just not that hard to understand that that this is an extreme version of Islam, a group of Muslim extremists who are crazy and dangerous and, are not representative of the mainstream, but they are representative of a fringe.
And with that, I want to thank both of you for coming on TVO tonight and helping us understand this better. Graham Wood, the contributing editor of The Atlantic. His piece is the cover on March edition, and he's a political science professor as well at Yale University. And Hussein Ibish from the American Task Force on Palestine. You can read more of his work at Ibish Blog. My thanks to you both.
Thank you very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.